So if individualism and communalism are a good example of a tension framework that's balanced in John White's artifacts, I think if we look at a new cultural tension that we haven't yet discussed in the class, the tension between religious faith as the way to truth and intellectual reason as the pathway to truth, we could fairly say that White's watercolors certainly dramatically focus on the religious faith side of truth, that both Native Americans and English colonizers believe that religious faith offers the ultimate explanation of our human experience on earth and the afterlife. So we see with White that several of his depictions of Native American culture are deeply concerned with Native American religious practices. And many of these religious practices would be problematic from a Puritan or Anglican perspective, would be seen as idolatrous or pagan, or at a minimum, a form of religious error. So here we see some kind of religious celebration, maybe a corn festival, some kind of equivalent of the English maypole dance, virgins in the middle, dancers with various decorations and musical instruments surrounding a series of poles with faces on the top, which by most anthropologists, and certainly by Harriet and White, were believed to be representations of Native American gods. So this would be an example of a religious festival, a religious celebration, and it would be something that was radically new, different, challenging, and in the minds of the colonists, a form of religious error that the natives were engaged in. So there's a shared religiosity, but very varied approaches to how to practice that. And White is exploring that through his watercolors. Another watercolor that gets really a profound interest for White and Harriet and the English was the Native American attitudes about death. And Harriet was to point out that as the quote here indicates, that the natives believed in the immortality of the soul or in an afterlife, but that they approached that belief in ways that would be very different between how a Puritan and an Anglican would. And this image of a charnel house or an ossuary temple where dead werewances or dead chieftains of the past are preserved explores sort of the dramatic difference in ideas about death. This would be seen as a primitive or pagan form of religious error to White and Harriet and their fellow Englishmen. The kiwash, the wooden God figure in the room, would be seen as a form of idolatry, and yet White is fascinated by it and details it very carefully. And I think that's because this is an access point of common belief systems in terms of the immortality of the soul and how do we prepare people for that and what happens to us after we die in a world with an afterlife. Let's take a look at the medicine man or the flyer, because this gets at a really interesting moment in A Brief and True Report. And that's the famous incident of the invisible bullets, where the natives were terrified by the fact that many other tribes and natives, even in their own tribes, were dying after encountering the colonists. This, of course, was they were dying of diseases that the colonists had built up immunity to and were bringing with them to North America, where the natives had no immunity to them. In fact, disease was going to be the number one killer of Native Americans on the northeastern coast of the United States, what became the United States, for decades. And this narrative captures that. And it's very interesting that the natives decide to interpret it as invisible bullets, which Harriet sort of looks at on disdainfully, sort of as something that points more to their ignorance. He sees the invisible bullets as something God is using to strike down those Native Americans who've opposed the colonists, and the colonists the Native Americans view these diseases as invisible forces that attack them. I think it's interesting to note that clearly the Native Americans were closer to the truth, that it was invisible biology at work, and that would not be figured out until Enlightenment era scientific reasoning prevailed and began to identify diseases and explore vaccinations for those diseases. I not identify diseases, identify the causes of diseases and begin exploring vaccination for those diseases. So this is an interesting moment, right, where religiosity and intellectual faith, intellectual reason collide, and both the natives and the English use sort of supernatural explanations to unpack something they don't understand. Ultimately, it's something that can only be understood through the use of intellectual reasoning, or was only going to be figured out through the use of intellectual reasoning, which was not going to come down the path for another 130 years or so. I also want to point out here the tobacco pouch of the medicine man, who, by the way, has been compared by scholars to representations of the Greek god Hermes, the messenger god, often is drawn in this kind of pose. And it's another example of perhaps a European pose being imposed by white on a Native American figure. The tobacco pouch is really important. It was the Native Americans who introduced the English to tobacco. Harriet loved it. He thought it was a curative that helped you feel better and helped cure you of minor ailments. It didn't turn out that way for Harriet, who eventually died of nose cancer, probably the result of his long-term and sustained and heavy tobacco use in his lifetime. An interesting example of something that's going to emerge later in American culture as a major social revolution, right? Smoking and the impact of smoking on our health. All right, let's look at one last image. I want to end with this image of an Indian priest, because I think it's important to recognize that this was a focus point for Harriet and White, and they were clearly engaged in prolonged discussions with the Native Americans about religion. And they clearly came to believe that the Native Americans had a religious capacity, were candidates for conversion, but were also limited in that capacity, and that the religion was one area, in one of many areas, which in their mind the colonists were superior, but the Native Americans had the potential to be sort of brought in under the penumbra, the umbrella of English Protestantism. Now, of course, this really seems to be a misreading even of White's paintings, where you can see that this was a culture, this Native American Southeastern Algonquin culture was clearly a culture with a very developed religious system. And the idea that they were going to cast this to the side in wonder of an English system that didn't seem to be working so well for colonists who could barely survive in the Roanoke environment, it seems like another example of a projection of White and Harriet's sense of culture superiority and desperate need to sort of see the potential for exploitation of the colonies in all aspects of Native American life. So again, just to remind you that I think we can say, in terms of the spectrum between religion and intellectual reason, that's going to become a very important force in American culture. In these early stages, it's clearly religiosity that dominates the artistic and cultural representations of the contact early colonial experience.